My name is Megan Bailey. I'm here at Dalhousie. I'm in the Marine Affairs program. I think generally I'd call myself a marine social scientist. I grew up in London, Ontario. I did my grad school at West, and then I moved here in 2015. We're joined by three amazing women today on the panel. We're going to go through about 40 minutes of some questions with the panelists and listening and learning from their answers, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A period. Going to try something a little bit different with this, and the courage and inspiration for this comes from Dr. Eve Tuck. She's a researcher at the University of Toronto, Indigenous researcher, scholar, theorist. And so I'll give you some more kind of direction around how the Q&A will go, but it's kind of about collective responsibility that we have to create a positive environment during the Q&A period. Sometimes those are not positive. So a little bit of an activity to think through when we're thinking about the questions that we'll be asking of our panelists today. Joining us online is Dr. Andrea Reid. Hello. Thanks, Andrea, for being here. I have not had the pleasure yet of meeting Andrea in person, but we've been electronic colleagues for a little bit. We met on Twitter a couple of years ago, as you do these days. She's now an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, where I did my grad school. So I wish our time there would have crossed over. The students are extremely lucky to have her. She's from the Nisga'a Nation. And I will say that every panelist will have a bit of a moment to introduce themselves as well. So I'm doing something very brief here, and then we'll give each panelist a little bit more time as well. Thanks for being here, Andrea. Bright and early on the West Coast. And then in person here today, we have Alanna Syliboy and Dr. Shelley Denny. Alanna comes from Sipekne'katik First Nation. As Evelyn mentioned, she works for the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq through the Mi'kmaq Conservation Group. I guess I would have met you through Abagamadultik. So over the last few years, worked together. This session is called Building Strong Indigenous Research Partnerships. And I would say from Alanna, over the years, I've learned we could replace strong with lots of other words like ethical and respectful research partnerships. There's a lot of kind of components of that. And thanks for reminding us of that over the years with the Abagamadultik. Dr. Shelley Denny is also with us, I think originally from Podladek, now in Eskazoni, Unama'ki. She's with the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources, UINR. Shelley has been an incredible colleague, contributing to classes and our teaching here. I met Shelley 6 years ago. I teach a master's fisheries management class, and Shelley began giving lectures 6 years ago, has continued to do so. And every year I learn something new. And she is taking on an increasingly larger role at the university here as an adjunct professor in her lots of free time that she has. So thank you so much. And as Kathy mentioned earlier, there comes a lot of asks and responsibility and load on all three panelists here. And so we really appreciate your time today, knowing that this is not the only place that you could be today. So I'm going to start with just a really hopefully easy question in terms of introducing yourself and a little bit of the positionality that you bring to the work. So the ways in which you come to the work that you've been doing around ocean conservation, stewardship, and science. And I'll start with you, Shelley.
Oh, great. Yes, as introduced, I am Shelley Denny, and I like to think of my positionality as one that comes from a place of working together. I always say I come from the school of Charlie Dennis, and Charlie Dennis was a former mentor of mine and my boss, who's now passed away. But he always said that we can't do things alone. Not any of us have all the knowledge that we need, so we need people to come together to work together. My positionality is also influenced by the treaty relationship that we have, or sort of have, in that we're all here. We're all treaty people. We all benefit from those treaties that were signed in the 18th century. And lastly, my way of being is influenced by the Mi'kmaq creation story, where Glooskap's mother embodied the strength to understand, so that Mi'kmaq people could cooperate and work together in harmony and peace.
Thank you. Andrea, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Megan, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you virtually. I wish I was in a chair alongside Alanna and Shelley with you all. I'm currently sitting in very much the dark, as it's still very early here on the West Coast. I'm currently in Nisga'a territory in the village of Gitlick-Damex, where I now live, which is the place of the ponds in the Nisga'a Nation. So right at the base of the Alaska Panhandle is the large and beautiful Nass River Lisms that I now get to work and live alongside, which is wonderful. As Megan already noted, I'm at the University of British Columbia. I'm in the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries, leading a group called the Center for Indigenous Fisheries, which is a team dedicated to research, teaching, and service that ultimately is with and for Indigenous partners, focusing principally with BC First Nations, given where we're situated and who we're made up of, but with some partnerships growing beyond that. Yeah, I think it's one thing I wanted to note off the top is that as we were thinking about some of the questions that we're going to tackle today, I think Shelley and Alanna and I were all reflecting a little bit on how we could be answering these questions from a range of positionalities as either researchers or as potential community partners that are being contacted for some of this work. And so I think it's really kind of from that dual positionality that a lot of us occupy that we'll be sharing some insights today. So pleased to be here and yeah, excited for this conversation.
Thanks, Andrea. Alanna?
Yeah, like Megan said, my name is Alanna Syliboy. I'm from Sibegay First Nation. In my organization, I work for the aquatics department, and I'm the culture, education, and engagement manager within our department. I've been there for 8 years now, and I think that the reason or the way that I think and the reason what I'm here is I am a community member. I'm not a scientist. I have no science background. I didn't. I have some now. But, you know, this work is needed on a community level, on the grassroots level. And that's what I do. So I help our communities understand the science and why it's needed. But I also take in turn helping organizations and government understand what the Mi'kmaq knowledge system is and how you use that and how to be respectful and how to be ethical, you know, because I met someone a few years ago and they told us, you know, science tells us what we can do, but ethics tells us what we must do. And this statement stuck with me for a really long time because it's true. You know, we can do all the science work too, but we have to make sure that ethics and responsibilities and respect is also included. So my main focus is, you know, ensuring that Etowoptimunk is being incorporated within the realm of both sides, you know, making sure that they're both sides are respected and comprehended, you know, asking questions and being involved from conception to end of projects. You know, you know, my position in this is making sure that my children, I'm a mom, and I want to make sure that my children are able to, you know, enjoy the things that we have in nature. Right now, I can't fish our traditional fish, which is salmon or blamu, but I want to make sure that, you know, in the future that my kids can fish that fish because of conservation method or reasons. I can't do that, but I want to ensure that my kids will be able to do that. So I have a lot of thoughts and positions within this realm, and I'm excited to be here, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Alanna, I'm going to come back to you for this question as well. Once I pose it, you'll be the first panelist to respond. So in preparing for this session, we had a conversation about what questions would make sense. And one of the things we do want to work hard on today, I think, is talking through successes and not necessarily kind of rehashing the things that go wrong and often continue to go wrong. And I think Elder Marshall's words about science being the arm of destruction is a you know, a very poignant illustration of like what can go wrong over and over again. But we do want to start from a place of positivity and success. And so what I'm hoping panelists can focus on in this question is a project that you've been involved in that you think of as a success. If you could name kind of one project, one collaboration, and some of the things that made that a successful project for you and makes it stand out for you, Alanna.
I think one of our biggest projects that I've been involved with is with OTN and our Apollo project that bring a lot of different partners together, you know, bring Shelley and I working closer together. And I was honored to be able to learn from her as well, and learn more about my culture and learn more about that side, but also learn a lot of science. Like I said, I wasn't a scientist, but, you know, this project has given me those tools that I needed to understand the science, so that when I took it back to the communities, I knew what I was talking about and I understood. Like I got to go to PEI and get trained to surgically insert tags into fish. And that was one of my biggest accomplishments. And that wouldn't have been able to happen if it wasn't for this Apollo project. You know, I got to understand the biology and all of the things that go into tagging, and I've successfully tagged tomcod, and I've watched them move from this little tributary in the middle of nowhere out into the bay, or from this river to this river, and seeing that, you know, seeing the data and being able to understand that, and coming from being this little res girl that, you know, barely ever left the community, and seeing the science world has opened my eyes a lot. And a few weeks ago, we had our salmon celebration with our organization, and a teacher came up to me and said, "We watched your Apollo panel in our classroom, in our science class, and the kids were amazed. And one thing, all of the kids stood out and says, all of the women are scientists, they're all women." And it really opened the eyes of these kids in this classroom. And they were really proud to see that women are stepping up into the science. So, you know, when you hear that coming from a community level, you know, it makes you feel a sense of pride and a sense of accomplishment, knowing that, you know, the work that you're doing and the things that you're learning, the things that you're teaching, it's getting out there on, you know, on those levels, not up just high ups, but on those levels, and that's a success to me. If I can be an inspiration to science kids in a classroom and give them girl power, like that's an accomplishment for me. And none of these things would have been possible if it wasn't for Apollo.
Thanks, Alanna. And the translation of that is we help each other.
Yes.
And so it sounds like reciprocity is really important in terms of everyone in that partnership learning new skills. And so it's, yeah, not ever kind of one group always giving, but the things that you're learning, because I'm thinking about how thankful I am of all the things you taught me. And so it's nice to hear you learned some things too.
I did, yeah.
Oh, thanks. Shelley, I'm going to go to you next, please.
I do appreciate the Bonamultuk, but one of the things that I am proud of my involvement is the social science aspect of FishWICS, the Fisheries Western Indigenous Knowledge Systems. I was there as a director for my organization and a research collaborator. But at the same time, that's where my eyes were opened up to the world of social science and how we could use social science forms of collaboration to enhance our research projects. So coming with a natural science background, my background is in biology and aquatics. That was really the moment that's like, you know what, I think natural science can learn a lot from how social scientists collaborate and how they create that structure to have shared decision-making within the project itself. But I am definitely proud. So I always say, is one thing I'm proud of is a Bonamultuk, which means we help each other, because it's a project that is guided literally by the principles of helping each other and recognizing that the relationship is the key to the research project, not necessarily the outcomes of the scientific research. So definitely a Bonamultuk has a special place in my heart.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Andrea?
Yeah, it's great to hear about these other projects, and I think there is so much that we can learn from what's happening in other waters. For me, I mean, I think this is a large project to speak about, but I think the entirety of my PhD for me was a really important kind of coming together in similar ways that I'm hearing from Alanna and Shelley, in terms of I had components that were large scale telemetry studies in the NAS and Fraser systems, which required working across many nations, working with many nations fishers to tag and track and monitor those fish. And that allowed us to study these fish in ways that we wouldn't have been able to otherwise, in that, for instance, here in the Nass River, working with the Niska Fisheries and Wildlife Department, using the Niska fish wheels and having the technicians on those fish wheels at different points in the river, we were able to recapture almost half of the fish that we had tagged going up the Nass River multiple times along their migratory route, and take additional samples from those fish. And for us to understand variation within an individual through space and time, which we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. But other components of my PhD centered on how we learn from Indigenous knowledge systems in this space. And for me, a project that really shaped my thinking and my understanding of salmon and their centricity to who we are as salmon people on the West Coast, because I didn't grow up on the West Coast. I grew up on the East Coast, on Ipecacuid, on Prince Edward Island. Getting to speak with knowledge holders across 18 different communities in BC and getting to interview elders about the state of our salmon, that for me was an incredible privilege, but also really, I guess, evocative of the way that we need to go about this kind of work to do it well. This required going through clear protocol in each community context and figuring out what permission looks like and what data sovereignty looks like and how they want this knowledge taken care of, because we can't just, open this Pandora's box of tell me what you know about these fish and then walk away. There's so much that's attached to it. And so that work for me was just a really important step in my own learning and in my own cultivation of partnerships across the province.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Yeah, that notion of data, you use this word stewardship, right? Which is really interesting, because we often think, and I think for an OTN crowd, like data management, right? Like there's data management committees. And to what extent kind of that idea of stewardship is a little bit different when working in partnerships. And I meant to just reiterate from Shelley's point about Fishwick. So there's a really great website. I think the website's still up. All the resources from the project is a very long, short partnership grant, I believe.
Yes.
So do check that out. A lot of Shelley's publications will be up there from her work as well as others. I remember when I first moved here, and I remember talking to Shelley's former, her PhD advisor, Dr. Lucia Fanning, and kind of saying, I don't know how to approach people. I don't know how to start partnerships. I don't know what to do, right? And partly Lucia's advice was well, you just got to start talking to people and approaching and trying and building those relationships. And now, I get a lot of students that come and ask as well, I'm interested in doing this kind of work. How do I partner with communities? That kind of thing. And it can be, intimidating. And I think particularly for students, right? There's already all this other stuff that you're trying to learn and know, and constant imposter syndrome. So starting new partnerships can feel risky and vulnerable. And so this question is about kind of when people are approaching you, or organizations are approaching you for collaborations and partnerships. And I think, speaking to Andrea's point about which hat are you wearing, it could be you as an individual researcher, as a community member, as a representative of an organization, a scientific organization, for example. What are the important considerations for you when somebody is coming to you to partner? What does that kind of look like? When you're looking for positive experiences around collaboration. And I'm going to start with Shelley.
One of the things that I look for is sincerity. I look to see if there's something that they want to do together. And then I throw them my partnership tents, which I used to call my deeper demands. So I have 10 different things that I would like to see that are my requirements for an effective partnership, especially if we're looking to integrate knowledge systems. And from what I've learned about being a Mi'kmaq person and Indigenous person is that it doesn't always come from a book, doesn't always come from an elder, but it's about our values and our belief systems that can help influence what we do and how we do things. So I do have partnership tenets, and one is the ability to develop early engagement, and sometimes that's not always possible. And when that's not always possible, then I try to see what benefit will we get out of this. Is this relevant to the needs of my communities under Unama'ki to natural resources, or the Bredor Lakes, or to Unama'ki, Cape Breton Island? So I try to look at those things. But if they're willing to follow the tenets, they're willing to share opportunities for publication, if they're willing to develop the budget so that they can include community governance, a community liaison is a very good way to ensure that there's always a point of contact and that the research gets done in the way that it's ethical to the Mi'kmaq people. So those things are really important. But also to having that collaborative structure for the process itself. So setting up a steering committee, ensuring that we have equal representation, or at least equal decision-making. We can have equal representation, and just to be able to work through the conflict as it arises, because it will arise, and being able to, ensure that we receive the same benefits that they would be receiving.
Thank you. There's a really nice Facebook post that Shelley had written for Abang Modultik that talked about these collisions and conflicts that do happen, right? And they happen not just in the development of strong Indigenous research partnerships, they just happen all the time. And so how to work through those as a partnership and the relationships involved in that. Thank you. And Andrea, we'll go next to you.
I don't need to add anything. Shelley covered it all. I think that really, for me, hits home like the key things that I consider. I'm really marked by a colleague of mine, Dr. Shondine Pete, who is now in Earth and Oceans at UBC. He's Flathead from Montana, and this is his first time living in Canada. And upon arriving, he kept hearing people say, "I'm an uninvited guest on these lands," and that wasn't something he never heard south of the border. And he just looked at somebody when somebody said that and was just like, "Man, go get yourself invited. You've been here 35 years, like go talk to people." And I think that's been kind of ringing in my ears since he said it, in that I think fundamentally it's about people's ability to talk to others. So I think as I get approached for collaborations or insight on collaborating, what I'm looking for is like evidence of whether they've already been talking to the people themselves or are positioned to do so. Like, is this work that is community led or has the potential to be? Everything that we do within the Center for Indigenous Fisheries is responsive to community needs and interests. And if it's not even open to that, then it's not going to be the right fit for the nature of the work that I and we do.
Yeah, thank you very much. Alanna.
The only thing I want to add is I think that when you're doing, you're having a collaboration, it takes time. And a lot of, people say like, this needs to get done. We have deadlines. We have, the funders need this by this point. Year projects are useless. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but building a relationship with the communities that you're working with takes time. It takes understanding. It takes being uncomfortable and just going in with that open mind and open heart. And, going back to what Shelley said in the beginning, we don't know everything ourselves and we have to work together and building those relationships. It's like any other relationship, right? You don't just enter marriage. You have to build that relationship and you have to get there. And those things takes time. And I get it that, we have deadlines, we have funders agreements and stuff like that. But if we can, that co-collaboration from the get-go, from time of conception of the project or any collaboration, that stuff takes time. And we want to build those things together. So just, I wanted to add, things take time. Good relationships need a good foundation, and that takes time.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll say as one thing that I've learned over the last few years about that is that we have a lot more power than we think in the university to ask for that time. From administrators, from grantings, from your deans, like whoever that is. So especially if you're an early career researcher, I would really encourage you to not take no for an answer when it comes to deadlines. If somebody's telling you that you need this in by a certain time and that doesn't work for the community, then just push back on that. And if it doesn't work, there'll be another funding opportunity. Like there are always funding opportunities. So think about what your partners need and how you can push the system you're in to help meet those needs as well. Okay, so I'm gonna ad lib a little bit. I gotta wait here. No, I was because I was just thinking about, so these are hearing a little bit about kind of, the good things that worked and what speaks to you when somebody's approaching you or an organization's approaching you. I'm just curious if anyone wants to speak to any stories where things went wrong, but more again from a learning perspective, not from like necessarily just a pure criticism perspective, but are there certain organizations, and is it academia, is it government, is it NGOs, like how does this differ by sector, where maybe there seems to be less wiggle room, or you need a bit more, those particular institutions need a little bit more force to change or to be more mindful and respectful of the relationships required. Andrea, I'll go to you first. So repeating my very verbose ad-libbed question was around the different types of organizations that partner, and if there are things that, kind of have gone wrong, or particular institutions that don't do this well, or do this well.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to speak first to this. I guess I'll focus on my own context, because with humility, we all make mistakes, and I've absolutely made mistakes in these spaces. And I think we as university researchers are really positioned to think about these relationships, as Alanna was just touching on, in a really linear way, and a really output oriented way that doesn't serve community interests well. And when I was getting started with telemetry work in LISMS, the Nass River, I went into it thinking the best way to approach this is by working with every single nation whose water these fish are moving through, and sharing data really openly across them. But that is exceedingly political, exceedingly challenging. But I didn't grow up in this context, and I didn't understand a lot about the history here that I have come to know and come to respect and appreciate and be humbled by. But the university tells you that, open data is the way, and that sharing data openly, open science is the best policy for transparency, for making, evidence-based decisions. But I think the open science framework really comes up against Indigenous data sovereignty, really leads to some potential tensions that exist there. So for me, that was just major learning, and allowed me to grow in real time and try to be responsive to what I was hearing from community partners, and shape my practice kind of as I went.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I think kind of maybe speaking to Shelley's earlier point about social sciences, is this idea that something that social scientists, I think we do a lot of things wrong too, but have accepted for a while, is that science is political. And I think there sometimes tends to be that, hopeful assumption that science is not political, and that numbers are numbers, and that's just not the case, right? These are very political, issues, as you say, Andrea. Thank you. Alanna, do you want to add anything?
We were doing a project with another funder, and we kind of put out a proposal, and they were quickly to cut our community engagement. They're like, you don't need this. They cut our honorariums, they cut our travel for community members. And then we decided, okay, this is not the partnership that we want and we need, because that's how we get the information, especially with this type of project that we were doing. So sometimes you have to feel what's best for you and the best fit for you and the benefits of your community. So sometimes, you're not always going to agree. Sometimes, you can have those conversations with the funders or whoever it may be, the partners, and you can adjust those things, but some won't budge. So you got to kind of pick and choose your battles. But, it always we always end up where we need to be when we're supposed to be there. And I'm a firm believer of that. So, just because something didn't work out doesn't mean that it's, it's a bad thing. And sometimes it's a good thing and greater things will happen.
Yeah, thank you. That reminds me of a colleague from the Nunatsiavut government. So for those who aren't from Canada, you might Nunatsiavut might not be a place you've looked for on a map. It's an Inuit governed land claim area in northern Labrador. And in writing a joint proposal together, there was a conversation about having equal funding. So in academia, we talk about HQPs, right? Highly qualified personnel, and there's budgets, and like a lot of money goes to students and HQPs. And the conversation with the Nunatsiavut government was, everyone that you're going to hire in community are also highly qualified personnel. They're HQPs. And so equal budget lines. If you're putting $100,000 into students, you're putting $100,000 into community liaisons, honoraria, whatever that is. So do think about that in your own budgets as well, right? Is so that your partners don't have to have the burden of telling you that you can't take that money away or whatever, but that, that money's on the table. So thinking in terms of like how to fund things and reconceptualizing what it is to be an HQP. Thank you. Thanks, Alanna. Shelley.
I've had the privilege of working with NGOs and academia and government. For the most part, one of the challenges that we struggle with is time. So, NGOs are a lot like our organizations where we don't have a lot of time. We don't have a lot of resources to get involved into developing a lot of relationships. Because of that, now I try to limit the number of partnerships I'm in a year, because it does get overwhelming at times, and it gets really difficult to keep those relationships going. I find though with, say for example, government like GF Department of Fisheries and Oceans, or Parks Canada, or Environment Canada and Climate Change, ECCC. The turnover is challenging. So building and maintaining those relationships, you get to know one person and boom, they're going somewhere else. Like Sandwich to Sharks, for example, with Heather. So like those things are challenging. And just when you get the relationship built and get the understanding in place, there's a switch. But for the most part, government is, required to work with First Nations. So we know that there's a place for us. But sometimes they have their challenges of not being able to go anywhere. They don't have the money to travel. They don't have the opportunities to travel like we would have. And with academia, I think they're pretty open for the most part. I think they're learners by trade. So it's an opportunity to have that co-learning. And they seem to be very receptive to being able to do something differently and innovative. So I do appreciate that about the academic world.
Thanks, Shelley. This question, I think in some ways we've covered a lot of this, but so I would just maybe ask if there's anything particular that you want to add. And Andrea, I'm going to go to you first. So it's around the lessons that you've learned. We have kind of already talked about some lessons, but through various collaborative research projects that you've been a part of that you'd really want to share. So thinking about, anything maybe that hasn't been brought up yet in your responses, any lessons learned on collaborations in keeping with that theme of strong Indigenous research partnerships. Andrea?
Yeah, I often hear from folks that, there's no like playbook in order to follow and have good guidance in these spaces. And I think that's profoundly wrong. There are so many wonderful books and resources out there to guide this thinking. And there have been some amazing scholars, researchers, community members operating in these spaces for decades. And it really, it's our responsibility as researchers, as technicians, as whatever positionality we occupy to go and do our homework and go and find out what those are. Many of us have compiled, lists of resources that can support this kind of thinking. And I'd point to, Max Liboron's Clear Lab as a wonderful repository of every kind of like frequently asked question, books to read, tons of resources there. So that's a great place to like start thinking about this. But to that point around funding that Shelley was just making, I think also just turning to your own institution to see what structures exist to support this, to support what's needed. So for within the UBC context, we have a wonderful group called the Indigenous Research Support Initiative, URSI, who have created an amazing amount of resources to support us in our roles, which include a template for building research agreements. So we're not just starting from scratch. It can be a really daunting task to just be like, where do I begin with this? On the point about funding, we have Indigenous finance guidelines, so that when we say we need this amount for a community liaison or for this kind of support or this kind of opening, we can point to this published document within our university that sets those expectations and that we can write them into our grants. So I think it's about, doing homework, finding those resources where they exist.
Yeah, thank you very much. Shelley?
Forgot the question.
Was any additional
Yes.
lessons learned or things you'd like to share with the audience in terms of collaborations?
Yeah, there was this one word that I always try to remember. It's called assume. It makes an ass out of you and me. So it's always good to remember that we're not the same. Everybody comes to the table with their own knowledge system. Everybody comes to the table with their own context and their own motivations and their own relevance. So it's best not to assume. And when you do, sometimes things can be tense. So it's always great to have an open line of communication, an open mind, and like Alanna said, an open heart.
Yeah, thank you. Alanna?
I don't know if I can follow up with that because the ladies have kind of touched on things that I've also have lessons learned. Again, it's like being considerate of everybody's viewpoints and what they bring to the table is a big thing. I sat at tables where I thought I did not belong, felt out of place. But then when my time came, I shined, and I doubted myself a lot because I don't have a science background. But I got encouragement and, having other people having open hearts and open minds allowed me to bring my strengths. So, the lessons I've learned is what Shelley kind of said, we all bring our own strengths, our own knowledge. And I think my lesson learned is to have more confidence in myself and the knowledge that I do bring, the knowledge that I hold, and the voice that I have for my people and the voice that I have for the lands and the waters.
Thank you very much. Okay. We're going to move to the experimental question and answer period. Okay, so I want you to ask yourself a few questions when you're thinking about asking a question. These are some of the questions you should ask yourself. Is it a question?
Mhm.
So if I said it out loud, would it end in a question mark? That's what Eve Tuck asks us to ask. So Albert Marshall invited comments. I'm not going to invite comments quite yet and reflections. I'm going to ask for questions first. Is it a respectful question? Is it mindful of the hard work that your panelists have already done? So kind of, is it a question that you could answer yourself if you actually did the work and used Google, for example? Should it be asked in a large group setting like this? Or is it really more of a question, that really matters to you, but might not matter to kind of the group setting? So those are some of the things I want you to think about. So we're going to take 2 to 3 minutes for you to reflect on your own questions, give our panelists a moment to have a sip of water, and myself included. So 2 to 3 minutes to reflect, think about your question. Then I'm going to let you know it's peer review time. I invite you to look to your neighbor, say, "Gway," ask your question, peer review it. If you're the person you're peer reviewing it says, "Don't ask that question, please don't ask that question." And then after that, we will open the floor for questions. So for right now, I would just ask you to take a couple minutes and reflect on everything that you've just heard. And if you have a question, to kind of formulate that and go through some of those prompts that Eve Tuck asks us to think through. Thank you.
It's almost like that saying that we have two because you're supposed to listen twice more than your dog. Because Andrea said that when we were, or someone said that when we were at a meeting one time. I'm like, my parents always used to say that, like, you have 2 years and 1 month, because you're supposed to listen twice as more than your dog. I'm bad at that. So that's good to know.
What's on for tomorrow? Am I allowed to know, or is it a surprise? Yeah. Maybe it's a surprise. Amen.
I think I should put my name tag on my mask, no? Just saying, I really should put my name tag on my mask, because you can't, everybody used to know that you're wearing masks and everybody's all masked up again.
No.
The sticky ones always get stuck on the hair. Okay, I'll have one.
These are much better.
Okay, 30 seconds. Oh, looks like people are already talking to doing some peer review. So if you haven't started your peer review, I invite you to do that for another minute. And then I don't want this to, I still want questions. I don't want, I'm not going to ask a question.
Nobody else, no. Usually when they don't ask questions, they'll follow you through the seat and then we get followed by a question.
Yes, that's totally true.
Go back to the respect and boundaries.
Boundaries, yes. Okay, and we have a runner. We've got a mic up at the top. Oh, okay. Did you peer review your question? Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to open it up and we've got a lot of time. We've got 28 minutes, which is wonderful. So thank you. And would you mind also giving your name as well? So for Andrea and others who might not know you. Thank you.
So good morning. Thank you to the panel. This was really enlightening. My name is Jean-Marc Nicholas. And my question is the following: that researchers and science traditionally goes out of its way to remove emotions from their work. We try to be as neutral, as independent as possible, but from the community members' perspective, whether it's resource management or whether it's environmental science, typically that touches a nerve. And it's the reaction of community members is often very emotional. And so I guess the question is, do you have insights on how to bridge that gap? How do you reach out as a scientist to emotional community members who want to understand, but maybe don't quite understand? And you want to have that synergy where everybody's pulling in the same direction. And it's not always easy to reach that. So I'd welcome your insights and any experience you've had in that area.
Thank you. I mean, I would also say that scientists can be emotional. I cry a lot. Partly after some abugabletic phone calls. But yeah, I mean, I think it also goes to the politicalness, right? Like these are emotional political things. So I just want to point out that scientists can be emotional too. Who would like to take this first? Andrea, was that you? Or are you pointing at us?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think, Megan, you're absolutely right. Scientists have emotions, and I think that we've been pushed for a long time to conceal them, as was framed in the question, and to not have our values, not have our biases shape our work. But I think our attempts at doing that fall short of achieving that. And I think by looking to see what our values are, what our biases are, how they shape our work, that's going to be truly informative of, we make value-based decisions all the time as scientists of what methods we think are appropriate, of what questions we even bother answering, who we work with, how we interpret the data. We infuse our values, our own bias into our work repeatedly. And so I guess I have a call to action for everyone to look at that within ourselves and not see that as a gap that exists between us and other segments of society. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that, but I think that science is really starting to shift in that direction where we are encouraging the positionality of individuals to be forward in the work rather than pretending it's not there. And we see that parallel happening in the realm of journalism as well. And for me, I find that when I have an interview with a journalist who is really taking that stance of, sorry, my throat's a bit dry, of not centering themselves in the work and kind of being that unbiased kind of neutral body, I find we have really stilted conversations where they're not being responsive to what I'm sharing and kind of evolving as the conversation does, versus many journalists now I find are shifting to putting themselves into the work and us having real conversations as we talk about what it is we're there to talk about. And I think that becomes really impactful. For me, it allows me to share in a way more real way.
Thank you for that call to action. Yeah, and I keep thinking back to Elder Marshall's comments about science and the arm of destruction, and like, if that's part of the problem, right, is not having the emotions kind of front and center in our inquiries and the questions that we ask, as you say, and how we answer them, and all of the places that emotions can be in. So thank you. I do encourage everyone to think about Andrea's call to action.
I do have something to
Yeah,
add.
please.
Though.
Yes.
When we're thinking about the values, that's fundamental to a move to two-eyed seeing. So it's good to recognize your own values when you're coming to the table to work with First Nations in particular. It's not a bad thing. It helps us work through what's important to what you need to be accomplished and what we need to be accomplished. I think one of the first times I pushed Mi'kmaq values in a project was the first time I worked with Ocean Tracking Network, and we implemented a mortality limit on salmon smolt, and it was based on nothing but emotion. That we would agree to a limit of 10 smolt. If 10 were killed during the process of whether it was, through surgery, recovery, that was it. It's over. So I had hoped it would make people more aware of the actions that they have on salmon, how they could be more careful and not treat salmon as salmon, but as a relation. So I think that was, very important that we brought that emotion forward and that relationship that we have with salmon and kind of imposed it onto the research project. But it's, if you want to do two-eyed seeing, it's very important that people reflect on their own values and what they need to see. And sometimes that's hard, especially if that's something you're not used to doing. So.
Thank you very much, Shelley. Alanna, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, not really. I think Shelley and Andrea kind of hit the nail on the head, and you have to look at your own self and to understand that connectivity. We're talking about collaborations and partnerships, and you have to understand both sides, especially when you're using Etowahkamunk. That there's a deep understanding. There's no protocols and guidelines. It's there's ways of knowing and ways of learning. And when you talk to our people, they're always going to get emotional. There's going to be emotions involved, and whether it's sadness or happiness or anger, because we are connected to this land. We're connected to these species. We treat the species differently. People are having mortalities, and they're like, oh well, these eels died for doing this thing, and I'm like, well, why can't we give those eels to the community for food? Like, people don't think about that. So just trying to incorporate both ways of knowing. It's like, we do have this way, but we have this way. Let's work together and come to a medium. So there's going to be lots of emotions on both sides, and I think we need to embrace those and bring the human back into the work that we're doing.
Thank you very much. I did have a hand at the back here. Thanks. And then I'll look this way. Sorry. And if you don't mind introducing yourself too, please. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much. My name is Reid. I'm actually from Indonesia. So I'm working with an NGO. Hopefully this is a real questions. I just wanted to gain some reflections as well. So I've been working with the community, Indigenous community who've been hunting whales for centuries. And then eventually we did the research. And, you know, we come to conclusions that there should be limitations for the community to hunt whales. So this, you know, at first, like the relationship went well, the communities are very supporting, but eventually, you know, because the management decisions kind of contradict their practice, traditional practice, it becomes really hard to kind of navigate, you know, with the communication or reconcile. So I'm just wondering in projects that you've been working on with species, especially you work closely with the Indigenous community, where your research results eventually leads into certain limiting people to catch fish, or you know, making some boundaries or something like that. And has there been any, you know, clash with the community members, and then how did you navigate towards that conflicts? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Who would like to take that one?
I'll go.
Dr.
for it.
Denny.
Andrea doesn't have her hand, so I'll give it a shot. I think, yeah, there's always risk when you have Indigenous people, when you have First Nations involved in research, there's always a political risk. And I think it's important to communicate the pros and cons at the beginning, like this is what could happen if we do this. It's a tough situation to be in, I would think, very much so. But it's up to the, you know, the researcher and who they're working with to really make it explicit, like there may be political, right? Maybe it's the lack of understanding of the political consequences too, right? So there needs to be a very open discussion about what could arise from the research. I'm trying to think of any positions I've been in that I can't really think of any off the top of my head, but I'll keep thinking. But yeah, I think it's just important that when people engage in that research relationship, that they need to be fully informed of the consequences.
Alanna?
Yep. I have an example. So we know that our rivers, so we do a lot of salmon monitoring in all of our rivers. So we know that the rivers don't meet conservation numbers. So that means that conservation supersedes our rights as Indigenous people. But I can't go to my community and tell my people that they cannot fish salmon. Again, it goes back to political. It goes back to science and numbers, but it also goes back to ethics. So what happened is we have all this data, we have all this information from our smoke wheels and our counting fences and our electrofishing. And we have these numbers and they're not feasible. So but I can't go to my community and say, you can't fish. That's, you know, I can't do that. So I was thinking, like, how can I help people understand the critical situation that our salmon are in? So what we did was we designed a workshop, and it was called Blamu and You. So Blamu is Mi'kmaq for salmon. And what we did is we talked about the conservation numbers, and we talked about, like we showed them on maps and you know, numbers and graphs and stuff like that. So we tried to get them the community members. So we held a session in each community. And then we talked about that conservation side, but then we also talked about, you know, the awareness of, you know, like, do you guys know that salmon are spawning in the fall when you're harvesting? And when you're harvesting these salmon, you know, you're taking those potential, the babies, the eggs, right? You're not allowing them to spawn, so they won't make more for the future. You know, just giving. And then we had identification issues. A lot of people were throwing, you know, keeping salmon thinking that they're trout, or, taking trout, thinking that they were salmon. So it's just like, how can we educate our community members to make better decisions for the species, but also, keep their rights. So we incorporated fish identification into the workshops. And a lot of people came out of that and didn't realize the state that the salmon were in. And they didn't realize, the difference between a trout and a salmon. And those things make, they make a better future for these species. We also talked about, good fishing tackle, bad fishing tackle, how to properly release. So we're giving the communities the information so that they can make informed decisions. But then I also had people come to the workshop who put me on blast and said, you can't come to you're so DFO, you can't come to our community and say we can't fish. And so it's again, picking and choosing your battles. I can provide the information and the knowledge to help people make informed decisions. So that was one way that we, you have to take the good and the bad. And I grew up, my dad was a conservation officer. And I grew up and I seen that other side of things. My dad's hauling in our community members, who are breaking the law. And my dad got ridiculed for years because, he's like, you're turning your back on your people. But my dad was there for nature. He was there for those species and the land. So, you have to kind of take the good and the bad. And hopefully, people can make better decisions with the information and knowledge that you provide.
Thank you, Alanna. Andrea, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, sure. I can't speak, to the Indonesian context that I know very minimally about, but when I think about the context in which I'm working with, for example, Wasanich nations on Vancouver Island, we've been in conversation a lot about their inherent rights, about Douglas Treaty rights that protect their right to fish, and about community perspectives of what that means. So for many, they have this feeling that my Douglas Treaty rights are that I can fish in any way, shape, and form I want to any extent that I want to. But for many elders in the community, they feel that that is a really big misinterpretation where through colonization, people have become really disconnected from the responsibility piece that, Elder Albert speaks often about, that our rights don't come unmarried from responsibilities. And something that we're working on with those nations is kind of that recoupling of understanding, what it means to be Wasanich in those waters is a right to those fish, but it's a right to take care of those fish in certain ways, to fish in certain ways that they once knew very, very well, and they still know internally in many of them. But I think that education piece, and like what Alanna just shared about not being able to tell a salmon from a trout, I think that's a big signifier of few fish in the water, lack of experience with these fish due to dwindling numbers, but also colonial processes separating us from our cultures means that we don't get to grow up in those ways that becomes really implicit to who we are, and that we know those rights and responsibilities in tandem.
Thank you very much. Is there a question on this side of the room?
Oh, I wanted to also share that there are a couple questions in the online chat, Megan.
Thank you. Okay, let's go online for a second, and the audience can think through if there's a question from the live audience. Oh my gosh, thank you. What's this? Okay. Thank you to whoever asked this question. I'm sorry, I don't have a screen in front of me. What are your thoughts on doing research that involves interviews with one or two individual Indigenous participants rather than having a partnership with a specific organization? Ways forward with this? Thinking about lessening burdens and workload for communities they may already be feeling stretched. This is always a huge question, right? Which is around research fatigue versus community consent and engagement, and that kind of balance as researchers. Alanna's nodding her head. So I think Alanna, is that question speaking to you? Do you want to give that a first go?
Sure.
Okay, and then Shelley, I'll come to you.
it was speaking to me, then I went blank. Yeah, like overexhausting our elders and our knowledge holders. It comes up with even within my own organization. I'm like, no, and I try to, ask our researchers what are you looking for? Is that necessary? So everything that is involving community members and interviewing goes through me. So I can make sure that, what we're doing, like you said before, like we have to make sure like, why are we asking this question? Is this question necessary? So things like that get through me so that I can make sure that we're not doing, workshop fatigue, interview fatigue, because you can only do that so much. And we don't want to put the pressure on our elders and knowledge holders. So there's that too, but also it goes back to the lands and the waters as well. I made it a point in our project, like, why are we always take? Why are we always doing the same research and doing every single day in the same area? Like, give it a break. Like the water and the lands and the species need to break just as much as we do, especially the fish, because they are susceptible to all of the things that we're doing to them. So I think that, being mindful of the fatigue, I don't think I'm answering the question, but
I think you're reinforcing that the issue exists.
yes, there is an issue, whether it's internal or external. And some people, some of our community members, they don't want to do these interviews because of trust, the mistrust. It goes back for generations, right? Why are you taking all of our information? What's it going to do? Because a lot of the time the research, you get it done and your research sits in a binder on a shelf somewhere. And how is that benefiting our communities? And that's something that we need to always be mindful about. How is this benefiting the communities? How is it benefiting the species? How is it benefiting the water and the lands and everything else? Because if you're just doing research to get more credits or whatever, and it's just going to sit on a shelf, that's something that we have to be mindful of. We don't want to overwork our community members and our organizations, because, to be honest, I'm still learning my culture. I'm still learning all of that because of colonialism, because of residential schools. I'm a third generation survivor of residential school and Indian day school. So, that's something else to keep in mind, is knowing that, the information and knowledge we try to protect it, and we try to have that sovereignty over that information and knowledge. So being mindful of that, like we're scared to share, we're scared, but we also have great, amazing elders and knowledge holders who are willing to share and to help because they know the benefits are there.
Thank you very much. Shelley.
Question again?
Question. So the question, so there's lots of components of this question. So part of it is this, I think if I can maybe paraphrase, I'm not sure if this is also intended in this question, but so sometimes you might partner with a community organization or a community, and there's like community consent, and there's kind of that stream. And then there's also this idea of interviewing individuals, right? Individual knowledge holders. So it's I'll say, as a chair of the University Research Ethics Board, you need both community and individual consent. So that is really important. It's not just about going into a community and speaking to some individuals. You need consent from the community. That's important. So there's that kind of aspect to it, but it's also about lessening burdens and workload for communities that may be already over researched.
Yeah, I think I would reiterate the ethics component. Maybe not everyone is aware of it. But even with working with NGOs, sometimes there's research that is done and it does involve interviews, but there's no ethics process for that, right? So it's important to have that understanding that there may be other considerations to take that may be required. I think it also depends on the context. Are you researching about First Nations or with First Nations, or like with? And I think that's a big difference. So when you're working with First Nations in research, then you're developing those processes that you can co-develop the research question, you can co-develop the methods. and how the data is going to be analyzed and interpreted and communicated. So I go for the code development always, but I know there's some cases where Indigenous peoples are part of the research process and are just part of the participant group. So.
Yeah, thanks, Shelley. Andrea?
Just for added context, while Alanna was speaking, Diane, who posed the question, also said, "You are answering. It's a great answer. Being aware of extractive nature of research. I have an inner conflict with these questions all the time, yet wanting to ensure voices are included and respected." Yeah, I think the root of the question of like the individual versus the collective, it is a tricky one for myself. I've tended to navigate to the collective first to see what in specific contexts, what protocol looks like. And in many cases, communities have said all you need is the direct consent of the people that you want to speak with. But in others, it means presenting to their council of elders, getting a written research agreement in place. It can look really different. So I think it's about being responsive in specific contexts. But there is a huge question here of like, an Indigenous organization or Indigenous leadership, be they hereditary or elected, like who holds the control? It is not, it's not a monolith. It's not the same in each context, and it is complicated. So it's about understanding the context that you're working within and to what end, to Shelley's point, and having that guide kind of your methodology in the process.
Yeah, thank you. That point about, protocols differ in different places. And that's a really important thing to remember as well. I'm going to wrap up. I think it's 5 minutes to lunch, and I don't know if the microphone caught my stomach. I hope it didn't, but I did hear myself a little grumble. But also that there's been a lot said this morning, like throughout the entire morning. And so I do think that the lunch break is also a really nice time to digest not only your lunch, but everything that you've heard as well. And do, talk amongst yourselves or reach out if you have questions. A lot of lessons learned, which is really helpful. So thank you to Shelley and Alanna and Andrea for sharing all of that. And for some of the calls to action as well, and the work that we all have to do in bringing our emotions and doing our research and spending time in community, building relationships. A lot there to digest. If everyone can please join me in a big round of applause for our panelists.